Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and in this review, we are taking a look at the Enleum HPA-23RM transportable headphone amplifier that comes in at $3,000 US. This is a kind loan to me by Audio46. Audio46 has made no attempt to influence my opinion on this piece in one way or the other. So the link that you will, all opinions that you're about to hear are mine and mine alone. The link for this product that you will see in the description below where you can buy it from Audio46 will be an affiliate link. So if you like what I have to say about this product and you're interested in buying it, please consider using that affiliate link and I will get a small kickback. I only use affiliate link money to support the channel, to cover things like shipping costs and accessories that I need, microphones, you know, that sort of thing, and also to eventually buy gear to review for this channel and all of that. This piece is really interesting and I actually really like it. It's basically two amplifiers in one. So I'm going to talk about what that means, why it's two amplifiers in one, what the sonic consequences of that are with a variety of different headphones and headphone types, and explain why I am really just quite enamored with this thing. And I wish that I could keep it. It's got to go back to Audio46 very soon. But if I can acquire one of these someday, or if the folks at Enleum are like, hey, if you're going to use that as a reference, which I will, okay, and we're going to send you one, I will not say no to that, okay? Just throwing that out there. Anyway, so stick around after shameless self-promotion and find out why I have fallen in love with this thing. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Wave Theory's human companion, and he wants you to know that your support of this YouTube channel helps keep the reviews coming. If you enjoy Wave Theory's honest, thorough style, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the links in the description below to sign up for the Patreon or send him a tip through PayPal. All right, enjoy the musings.
As is often the case, as I get to talking about these kinds of things, particularly when I get excited about them, or just in general when I have a lot to say about them, which is almost all the time, okay, these videos start to get kind of long. So I have time-stamped this out, so check the timestamps down below to jump around and see the parts that you are most interested in. We're going to do a quasi-overhead view here in just a moment where I give you a close-up of the build and we talk about the features and the specs and all of that. Then we'll come back on the other side and I will talk about test gear and then general sound impressions on this from either output. And then after that, I will go at length about like different headphone pairings that I tried, because I think that's where this thing really gets interesting, is that it drives pretty much everything, at least everything full-size headphone that is not an electrostatic, which is really a key selling point for this piece. And so I did a deep dive on what it does with different headphone pairings. So we're going to talk at length about that later on. And then finally, after that, we will wrap things up. All right, let's get to it. Quasi-overhead view again to look at the build of the HPA-23RM. And also show you that this is the protective box that it comes in. When it gets shipped to you and you unbox it, this is what it's in. And it's made of like a fairly rigid, fairly tough cardboard that's got magnetic seal here on the bottom. You can subtly see the outline of a couple of magnets in here to hold this thing closed. And it kind of snaps back together there when you close it and all of that. So more on that in a moment. But on the inside, you just get this foam with this nice little cutout here to get your finger in. And then there is the unit itself, okay, which we will look at here in detail in just a moment. All right, but I want to make one more comment about this box, because this is a transportable unit here. It makes sense that you would be traveling with it and you, you know, for your $3,000 portable transportable headphone amp, you probably want to protect it somehow as you are moving around and it's in your bag or your suitcase or whatever it is and all that. And this box actually does a decent job. It is, you know, again, reasonably rigid and tough on its own. It's got the magnetic closing flap here, okay, and all of that. And honestly, it is not much bigger than like a lot of, say, college textbooks, right? Okay, it's just in terms of the size, it's reasonably close, I would say. And I'm sorry that the camera is tight there, but just to give you a feel for the scale of that thing, like, yeah, a book, okay, can kind of be, this is an example of like how big this is and how, or more specifically, how big it's not. It does a good job of protecting this thing without adding a ton of bulk. Okay. The HPA-23RM itself. It is a compact and heavy little unit, metal casing, and all of that all the way around. Like, it is well constructed. It's got these nice little ridges going on here for aesthetic flair, and also there's probably some cooling and ventilation, maybe not ventilation, but I want to say that's probably related to some heat sinking, but even if it is just purely aesthetic, I think it looks nice. All right, I mean, machined, I'm pretty sure aluminum anyway, and all of that. And the only real complaint I have about it is that the corners here are a bit pointy. Okay, so I can foresee that bumping this and that being a little bit painful if you catch one of these corners. And again, it's heavy. Like, it is packed in there and so forth. All right, on with the good stuff here. All right, gain switch, high and low, that's all you get. 2 single-ended headphone outputs, a 3.5 millimeter or 1/8 inch output here, which you see labeled voltage, and then a 6.35 millimeter / 1/4 inch right here, which you see labeled current. So the website for this piece describes it as essentially being 2 amplifiers in one. And that is because it has a voltage amplifier in it and a current amplifier in it. So we'll wrap some specs into this too. The voltage output here is based on the MOSFET output stage of the Enleum HPA-23R, and so then that uses a Jet 2 bias circuit in there, which is Enleum's name for how they build their circuits in there. Okay, slightly updated and scaled down to fit into a portable unit. And then we also have the current drive output, which is an updated and miniaturized version of the current output that was in the Bakun HPA-21, okay, right in there. The voltage output here has a rated power output of 500 milliwatts per channel into a 30 ohm impedance load, and then a rated battery life at that setting of 5 hours. And then the current output here is rated at 1 watt per channel into a 30 ohm impedance load, and then the battery life rating on that is spec'd at 3 hours. Okay, then what we have here are, this is the battery indicator for level. We've got 3 white LEDs in here. I can turn them on real quick. Okay, they blink at you when this thing turns on and when it's ready to go, and then you get an idea of the battery life going on here. All right, volume knob is got a nice, like, you know, it's not circular, so like you can get your finger in there and grab it fairly well and turn it reasonably well, and then it's also covered up, so it's really difficult to accidentally bump this thing. You like have to get your finger in there to turn it, and it's got enough amount of resistance on it that it never feels cheap. It feels good and all of that to use. It's got a satisfying click for on, off, and power, and yeah, it seems like I got a little piece of dust or something down on that LED in there. Okay, anyway, the volume knob here is connected to a fancy schmancy relay attenuator, which when you have a headphone plugged in and you start adjusting the volume here, you can hear the clicks of the relay attenuators through the headphones. And how loud that is depends on like what kind of headphone you're using and like what that headphone's impedance and sensitivity rating is and all of that kind of stuff. Okay. So that's that end, and then we see we have these nice, you know, textured, ribbed kind of things here on the side panels there, and then on the back. 1 input, really. Like, there's no input switching here. You get just a single input that you have to choose, either a 3.5 millimeter TRS single-ended input, like an aux cable kind of connection, or a standard RCA input like that, where the jacks, you see, are also recessed down into the housing in there, and that's good for, like, you know, again, portability and all that, but it does limit the size of connector that you can connect to these. World's Best Amphenol cables that I have that I use a lot, World's Best RCA cables with Amphenol connectors. I have a bunch of those around because they're reasonably high quality, reasonably cheap, and, you know, doing this job, I need a bunch of them. So those just those fit in here fairly snugly, and it feels secure and all of that. But like, if you get a bigger connector, like any kind of twist lock connector, if it's on there, is not going to really fit inside of here. I have a pair of anti-cables, RCA cables, that were loaned to me to check out. Those don't fit in here either. So that's just a thing that you're going to have to keep in mind as well. Anyway, I would argue the more travel-friendly aux input, and then the more desktop-friendly and more often than not RCA input. I used the RCA input almost exclusively for my testing, though, because I just don't really have this kind of a cable that I felt like would match up to my WBCs to use with that. All right, and then we have a USB-C port here, which is charge only. This is just an amp. There is no DAC in it or anything like that. The power cord, the charger that comes with the unit, is on the cheap side, but that's okay, because all it needs to do is charge the battery in here. This thing has no bearing on the power that is delivered to the audio circuit. That's just the internal battery doing its thing in there. This is the power cord for a Raspberry Pi, basically, and it's got a 5.1 volt 3 amp output on it, and that charges this thing up reasonably quickly. Real quick, the rated battery power on this, or battery life, I should say, at 3 hours for the current output and 5 hours for the voltage output, did seem reasonably accurate. You're probably not going to hit that exactly in the real world because, like, again, because they measured the output power at 30 ohms impedance, they probably did the battery life spec at the same, and like most headphones are not going to be you know, exactly 30 ohms. And of course, they're also going to vary in their sensitivity. The more sensitive the headphone is, the less you'll need to turn the volume up, which means the less energy you'll be pulling from the battery, which means the longer the battery will live. And then conversely, of course, the less sensitive the headphone is, the opposite is true. Then the more energy it's going to have to draw from the battery to get to the volume level you want, which means the battery is going to drain faster. Now, the battery life on this, just even in the ideal circumstances, is not great. And I think that was a sacrifice they made, for one, to get it into a package this size, because it's not very big, right? Like, I was joking with some friends that this thing is smaller than a VHS cassette. If you remember what those are like, it might be a little bit wider this way, but the length and the thickness of it definitely smaller than a VHS cassette. Okay, they sacrificed some battery life for just sheer output power because, and I'll talk more about this as the review unfolds, the output power here drives pretty much everything, right? Like, I plugged Susvara into here and it handled that beautifully. And that should say all you really need to know for how much output power this thing is really capable of. But the sacrifice of that, I mean, it comes down to physics, right? It's a law of conservation of energy thing. Any battery that you put in here that's going to fit into this size case, well, any battery, period, is going to have a finite amount of energy that it can output before it is depleted, all right? And it takes energy to move a headphone driver. All right, and so at some point, moving that headphone driver is going to deplete the energy store in the battery. And so the harder it is to move that headphone driver, the quicker the battery is going to deplete. But Enleum has made the calculation that getting 3 hours of high output power to power something like a Susvara, probably not quite a full 3 hours because the Susvara is like a 60 ohm and like low sensitivity headphone, right? But getting, conservatively say 2 hours in a transportable situation out of a Susvara, use the Susvara anywhere you can safely use it that you want to, is a worthwhile trade-off, and they could very well be right on that. Okay, so with that, we'll turn back to test gear and sound and all of those kinds of things, and I may come back to this view to talk about headphone pairings in a little bit as well. All right, test gear for this thing. The signal chains that I used to test this primarily from a source standpoint anyways, it got a little bit of time on my primary desktop system where I used the single-ended output of my Berkeley Alpha Series 2 DAC, which was in turn fed by a Singer SU6 DDC, which was in turn connected to a Sonor Ultra Rendu streamer, which was being used as a Roon endpoint to play lossless or high-res FLAC files and DSD files locally, or stream lossless or high-res FLAC files from Qobuz. All right, the other signal chain, and really the primary signal chain that I use to test this, at least from a source standpoint, would be this right here. I would use the RCA output of my Chord Hugo 2 transportable DAC amp, which is also connected to its matching 2Go streamer, also used as a Roon endpoint, playing the same kind of file types that I just mentioned. But this right here and this thing, both of them being transportable devices that have RCA connections on them, I figured that this would be a really cool piece of source gear to test with this amp, and that ended up being true. So this got a lot of time as the source into this. As far as headphones go, you're going to see, as I mentioned at the top of the video, you're going to see a deep dive on the different headphones and headphone types that I use here in just a little bit. So the specifics I will leave to there, but I made sure that I tried mostly full-size headphones on this. I did have an IEM in there too that I will talk about, but otherwise I tried a range of headphones, including low impedance dynamic driver, high impedance dynamic driver, low impedance planar, medium impedance planar, and high impedance low sensitivity planar magnetic headphones all in there. So we'll get to the specifics on that in just a little bit. So with that, let's turn to the overall sound impressions here, which are going to be pretty much glowing because, again, I really like how this thing sounds, okay? It is 2 amps in 1, what it comes down to. The voltage drive and the current drive outputs here do sound different. All right, and so let's get into that a little bit, and we'll start with the lower powered one, which is the voltage drive, and then we'll get to the current drive, which I think is going to be the biggest draw for most people and all of that. But the voltage drive output here is the more neutral sound signature of the 2 outputs. It also is the more detail forward of the 2 outputs there. Both outputs, the voltage and the current, I would say are basically equally resolving or very close to. It's just that the voltage output in general, and there are a couple of exceptions to this which I will name in the headphone synergy talk in just a little bit, but generally speaking, the voltage output has a little bit more detail forward presentation, which gives it a little bit more crispness, a little bit more clarity, and a better sense of both spatial and instrument and vocal separation. So like with the spatial stuff, there was a clearer sense of sound is here and it's not, sound is here, and it's not in here kind of sense with the voltage output as compared to the current output. Okay, but the voltage output though has a narrower soundstage. It sounds a little bit smaller in general, although interestingly it also sounds a little bit farther away. Like the distance from head to where its sounds are coming from sounds a little bit bigger than it does from the current drive output and all of that. Now, the voltage drive output has a reasonably okay timbre. With some headphones, it wanders into sharp and sibilant territory more than the current drive output does, and also more often than the current drive output does, but that isn't a lot, and it's not really a deal breaker, and when it does happen, it avoids the overall harshness most of the time. One exception is going to be the original Focal Utopia, but just because that one is a cranky headphone at times, okay? But generally speaking, when it does go sibilant, it's not all that piercing or all of that, painful or that when it happens. So that's kind of an overview of the voltage drive output. Let's talk about the current drive output here. The current drive output, again, gives you more output power, but it also has a very different sound to it. from a perceived frequency response standpoint, it is warmer than the voltage drive output more often than not with most pairings. Okay. There is an exception to that, which I will bring up when we get to the individual things. But generally speaking, warmer. It's also a little bit thicker sounding. And the way that it does that is it kind of has a stereotypically tube-like sound. And I say stereotypically again purposefully here because there is no one tube sound. The sound of tube audio products is as varied and diverse as any solid-state products that are out there. Okay, or as they are on the solid state side, I should say. You can have the warmer, thicker, wetter sound like at the entry level a dark voice or a bottlehead crack, or you can get a very neutral and accurate kind of sound like an LTA, for example, and everything in between. Okay, the point that I'm making with this here is that the current drive output on this thing, generally speaking, has a little bit of that warmer, thicker, wetter sound to it. So it just sounds a little bit fuller and richer, has a little bit more weight and tonal density to the sound than it does for, compared to both true neutral and the voltage drive output. And then that wetter sound means it kind of blends things together a little bit more. Like the trailing edge of one tone kind of flows into the leading edge of the next tone a little bit more, like, I'm getting, it sounds wet, like more fluidy, more viscous-like, okay, thicker. Okay, that kind of a thing going on here. And so that's neither good nor bad. It just is how it sounds most of the time. The one exception that I found to that was the Susvara. That was still there a hint, but the Susvara kind of cleaned up that nature of it a little bit. Okay? All right. The other thing about the current drive output is that it is very powerful, like dynamically powerful. Very hard hitting, very full present bass. Like a lot of the headphones that I plugged in almost had a bass shelf, a sub bass shelf in particular, added to their sound from the current drive output as compared to the voltage drive, but then also compared to many other amps that I have heard those various headphones on. So, and then it's also very potent, very hard hitting physicality in that low end, but that physicality also translates up through the rest of the frequency range, where it just, like, it's just fun and lively and dynamic and energetic and all of that to its sound, while still having that tube thickness and that wetness sound to it. So it is both smooth and relaxed in terms of like the detail kind of presentation. It's still quite resolving. Most of the details and all of that are in the texturing and all of that are still in the sound. It's just laid back and smoother in its presentation, but then the dynamics are on the aggressive side. They're just fun, they're hard hitting, they're active, they're lively. It's a very unique and interesting, and again, I found more often than not, enjoyable presentation in there. And then the sound stage is very wide, usually on the current drive mode, like wider than the headphones normally are on other amplifiers, kind of a thing, like just a very wide sound stage. But the imaging and the separation in there, the imaging is good, like where things are pretty solid, but where it's not quite as strong as it is from its own voltage output is that the separation between sonic images is not as crisp, is not as clear. So it doesn't sound as overall holographic and three-dimensional as the voltage drive output can sound. It's still good. Like, don't get me wrong. It's not poor in the imaging and the separation or the depth and the layering and all that. Just not as strong as it is from its own voltage output. Okay, so there are trade-offs in the sound either way here. Both sound really good with the right headphones, and so you really do get two amps in one here, two distinctly different sounds that have their own strengths and weaknesses and all of that. That is just a very interesting and compelling package there on its own. So what we're going to do now then is cut to me talking about how a wide range of headphones, and I'll sneak an IEM in there, sound on this amp. So let's do that. All right, I want to talk some specific pairings with different transducers with the 23RM here, just to talk about like what I found, how well it drives some things and all of that. I did try my HiFiMan Svanar, which is the highest end IEM I have in my personal collection. And given the output power of the HPA-23RM here, I don't think that it's going to be mated with IEMs a lot because it's really more of a headphone driver. But I know some are going to ask how it sounds with IEMs, and I don't have a whole lot of IEMs around just because I'm not primarily an IEM user. But I do have these around. And so these are 60 ohm and 100 decibel per milliwatt sensitivity rated IEMs here. And they're $2,000 US. I have a review out for these, which I can link to in the description. And I wanted to bring these out because, like, notably, as I mentioned in the sound section, you get different sounds from the current output and the voltage output. And whichever sounds better really depends on what you're driving with them, provided that this thing has the power to handle it from either output. And with the Svanar, one thing that I did notice is that the current mode output here had a noticeably higher noise floor than the voltage drive output did. And opposite the trend that I'm about to tell you with a bunch of different headphones, I thought the current drive output for this one actually had the smaller sound stage than the voltage drive, which is opposite pretty much every other headphone that I use. So this just stands out as a unique case there. But this IEM still sounded really good from this thing. Like, I didn't have any complaints about the overall sound quality. I did prefer the voltage drive output for this one just because of the added crispness and clarity and a little bit like tight or a little bit more separation in the spatial presentation, but then also the instrument and vocal separation stood out just a little bit more here. And but there really wasn't a whole lot of signature change from like a perceived frequency response between the two outputs here. Maybe a hint of added warmth from the current drive and a little bit more neutral from the voltage drive, but not a lot. And then again, like a consistent thing here is that the current drive output is a little bit thicker sounding because it's a little slower on the decay, so it has a little bit wetter sound, a little bit more blended together kind of sound of a previous note into a successive note right there kind of a thing. They just blend together a little bit more and they're separated a little bit more from the voltage output. So I preferred voltage on this one, but if someone claims to prefer current here, you're not going to get any grief from me. That makes sense. Okay, so that's the Svanar. Let's talk about some full-size headphones then. Again, because I heard the noise floor on the current drive output, even on low gain, through the not particularly low impedance or easy to drive Svanar here, if you have something like a Fur M5 or something like that that is very low impedance and very sensitive, you may have some noise floor issues with this thing. So I really think it's better suited for headphones, full-size headphones. So on that subject, let's look at some. I don't have any high-end, like really high-end, high-impedance dynamic driver headphones on hand, but I do have these two. Mastrop Sennheiser HD6XX, which is 300 ohms, and then the Beyerdynamic DT880 600 ohm version, which I have removed the stock cable and detachable modded myself so that I can use these from a balanced headphone amp if I want. Okay. I preferred both of these from the voltage output of this thing, and it had plenty of power for both of them. Like, I never got the sense that the DT880 was underpowered in any way here, since that's the harder to drive of these two. Plenty of power, nice full bass, punchy bass, and all of that sort of thing from both outputs. But again, I preferred the voltage output for these two, but like these high impedance loads like this prefer voltage drive generally. My understanding is something like the Beyerdynamic T1.2, which I did a written quasi review of, well, I don't know, 3-ish years ago, which I can try and find and link to. Does well with current drive, but by and large, high impedance tend to need the bigger voltage swing. So the voltage to me sounded better here. It was crisper, it was cleaner, it was a little bit more holographic, even though the sound stage was a little bit narrower. Again, that's a trend. Narrower sound stage. It was still a little more holographic within those things. But if you are a bass head and you just need big thumping bass, the current drive output really brings the bass up on these things and just like makes it hard hitting and just like a lot of rumble and all of that that can be fun. It just sacrifices a little bit of the clarity and the overall like cohesiveness and refinement of the sound in exchange. Okay, so that's these two. Let me go get a couple of other headphones. This is my Fostex TH900 Mark II with Lawton purple heart chambers on it. The reason it has funky looking connectors is because it was originally an attached cable model way back, and I've had to replace the drivers and put different stuff, cups on it, which is why it's Lawton now and all that. So anyway, that's why it looks weird. It's because it's custom like that. This I used as one example of a low impedance dynamic driver headphone, because that's what it is here from the Enleum. And these sounded pretty good on these. Now, the TH900 series is notoriously amp picky, okay, in a very real way. And like my favorite amps that I have heard for this one are probably the Headamp GSX Mini, the Erzatich Perfitus, and the SPL Phonitor X. The Enleum here is not quite to the level of those just named for this headphone, though it is still like in like the top third, I should say, in terms of amps that I have heard and to how it pairs with this. The sound did change again from current and voltage output. On this one, I preferred the current drive because, like, one of the stars of the show is the Biodyna bass in this thing, right? Just huge, thick sub bass that hits hard, rumbles for days, and all of that kind of stuff. Not in a sloppy way, but just like it has rumble for days, as in it's a lot, right? Okay, and that sort of thing. And the current drive really brought that out here. The current drive also, because it's a little bit smoother and more laid back sound generally, takes some of the bite and the sibilance out that the Biodyna drivers in these things can have. All of that. So I would not really recommend this pairing generally speaking, but I will say that as far as transportable amps go, this is probably the best combo I have heard. You may like it. I didn't love it, but it was interesting that this did as well as it does with the Biodyna drivers in here. All right, something else. A pair of focals. Got the Radiance right here, which I believe it's either a 32 or a 35 ohm impedance dynamic driver. And then we have the original Focal Utopia here, which has a nominal 80 ohm dynamic driver in it, but it like really spikes up to about a 300 ohm impedance around its resonant frequency, which is somewhere around 60 to 80-ish hertz. I don't remember exactly. It's in that range. Okay, exactly where it is isn't the point here. Just that it exists is the important part for this discussion. Okay, so the Radiance I used as like another example of a low impedance dynamic driver just to kind of get a flavor for how the Enleum performs that from both outputs. Mixed bag results on this. Like the Radiance sounded pretty good from both output types. Okay, and it's just going to be a matter of your personal preference if you ever use this pairing, which one you would prefer with this. The Radiance, which is already a warm, bass-heavy headphone, became even bass-heavier. Like the bass on this was just really powerful, hard-hitting, and just a lot of bass presence, like almost an elevated bass shelf from what it already has, and it just rumbled. It was still nicely textured and good pitch definition and all of that in the low end, okay, but just a lot, even extra bass coming out. I preferred the clarity and the added sense of detail retrieval from the voltage output on this one, though, because it already is just like bass thick and heavy as a matter of course. So overall, I preferred the voltage drive output on this one as compared to the current, but the current drive had better vocal timbre. Not a lot better, but noticeably better than the voltage drive output there had. And then the current drive also, as is generally the trend, had the bigger soundstage, but the voltage drive had like the better spatial separation and all of that going on with the Radiance. So interesting like results here. Whichever, if you had this headphone that you wanted to drive this with, a little bit of a price imbalance, but if you were going to do that, I think whichever output you use is probably going to depend on what kind of music you're using for these two. The Utopia is another notoriously picky headphone, at least when it comes to signal chain. It really responded well to the current output of this thing, but not the voltage output. The voltage output on this pairing sounded really sibilant, really shrill, and really harsh in the treble, and the soundstage narrowed to a degree that I didn't like, and to a more extreme degree than it did other headphones that I tried. The current drive output on this, though, really changes the character of the Utopia. It sounds like a different headphone. The Utopia is often like just kind of walking that line of being a little bit too forward in the upper mids, lower treble, which kind of gives it a little bit of a bite to it. This really didn't do that. This like really kind of the Enleum here kind of pulled that back, smoothed it out quite a bit, and made it a much more pleasant headphone. And then it also kind of like had like that stereotypical tube-like quality of just being a wetter sound. So like things flowed and blended together more. It wasn't dry or chalky sounding or anything like that. It's just the opposite of that. But then like the thing that really stood out here was just like the bass on this, which is normally very punchy and impactful, but it's not super like, it's not elevated. Like it doesn't have a bass shelf from like an added presence and increased frequency response kind of standpoint. All right, but it does on this current drive output. It just really thick, really heavy bass, lots of rumble in the low end, really powerful, still controlled, still textured, still with good pitch definition and all of that kind of stuff. But like it honestly kind of starts to sound like the Radiance, just in terms of how much the bass comes out and like how hard hitting it is and all that. Just interesting. It's not going to be for everyone. I enjoyed it. It was fun, though I do recognize that it kind of changed the character of the Utopia from what it normally is. So that's just something to be aware of. But again, I enjoyed it and thought it was fun. Okay, and a switch up from what this thing does on other amps. Abyss Diana MR, which I did a review of recently as well, so I'll put a link in the description for that down below here. This one, it was interesting to have on hand at the same time here, because like this Diana MR is like touted to be like the most transportable friendly of the Dianas, and that's probably true. And so I got to try it on this amp here, and the Abyss Diana MR just wasn't for me. Okay, I didn't find it particularly resolving, but that plays a role in terms of how it sounds on this amp here, because like both the voltage and current drive outputs on this thing have plenty of power to power this headphone. The Diana MR is like a low-ish impedance and middling sensitivity planar magnetic driver headphone and all of that. So both outputs of this have enough power to drive it. So that's not the issue. The current drive mode on this, just because it's again a little bit warmer and a little bit smoother and a little bit wetter sounding and all of that, was not a great match to the MR in my opinion, because it's already a smoother and not particularly resolving kind of headphone. So it just got a little bit too much of that. Like it was just a little bit too thick, a little bit too lacking in detail overall and all of that. Even though like the resolution from the current output is all there, it's pulled back a little bit. It's not as forward as the voltage output. So I liked this headphone more from the voltage output on this thing, because the slightly drier sound and the little bit more detail forward presentation on all of that really helped bring out some of the details in the resolution, that to the extent that the Diana MR is capable of doing those things. So I preferred that combo there. All right, the two top-end HiFiMan planar magnetics here. We've got the HE-1000 SE, which is currently $2,000 US, and it is a low-ish impedance and high-ish sensitivity planar magnetic headphone. Pretty easy to drive, easier to drive yet than the Diana MR that I just showed you. And then we have the big one, the Susvara here, which is a 60 or 64 ohm, something like that, impedance headphone, which is kind of high-ish for a planar, but then it's a very low sensitivity planar, so it's a very difficult drive for any amp, basically. And so let's talk about what these two do. We'll start with the HE-1000 SE here. This thing sounds wonderful from the Enleum, regardless of which output type you use, and it's just going to come down to personal preference, which you like more. And this headphone perhaps reveals more starkly the difference between the two outputs type than any other, just because it sounds good from both of them. And so I'm really getting a sense of like, this is what each output sounds like, kind of a feel because of it. And so this one really clearly shows how more often than not, the soundstage of the current drive output is really big, though it is not as holographic or as like three-dimensional in its imaging and its separation. It blends everything together a little bit more, not as well separated. Okay, it does show me that the current drive output on this thing is every bit as resolving as the voltage drive output. It's just that the finer details are pulled back a little bit more. They are not as forward. Again, and so then it also shows me that the current drive output has that wetter sound to it, the more blended together kind of sound where trailing tones of one note kind of more flow into the leading tone of the next note kind of a thing, which can be stereotypically, and I say stereotypically purposefully, stereotypically tube-like in that sound from the current drive output here. And then also, I thought the timbre from the current drive output was slightly more natural, particularly when it comes to vocals. I just thought human voices sound a little bit more real and natural to me from the current drive output than they do the voltage drive output on this thing. Okay, but the voltage drive output, again, it has the more accurate sounding, the more holographic, three-dimensional spatial presentation going on here, even if the soundstage is a little bit narrower. It's not as dynamic or as lively as the current drive output either, though it still has a fair amount of that through this headphone and so forth. And then the timbre is not quite as natural, at least through the vocal range, or for at least human vocals in particular, but also some mid-range instruments. But that extra sense of clarity and resolution and the more accurate spatial presentation and all of that also stand out on the voltage drive output on this. So for a headphone like this, which this thing can comfortably drive from both outputs, you kind of get two headphone experiences in one, okay, with this thing, with this particular headphone. So I really enjoyed this pairing, and I could see, like, if there were a nice way to transport the Hexi, it's kind of a big headphone, but if there were a nice way to transport it, boy, I would really like to take it with me, and this thing and all that as a travel companion, and if I could, because that just sounds really good. Okay, at least for sound, ditto how good it sounds with the Susvara from the current drive output. The current drive output's the only one here that has sufficient power to push this headphone. Okay, and push it well it does. Like, it sounds great. And it also just like synergizes really well because like where the detail presentation, the forwardness of the details can be a little bit withdrawn on the current mode output of this thing on some other headphones. It does not come across that way to me on this one. Now, the voltage output will drive this headphone to lower volume levels, and so I do think that it was still a little bit more detail forward than the current output on this thing, but the voltage output is really going to start to distort in the bass, and it just does not have the power when you start getting up to like reference listening levels for me, which is around a 72 to 75 dB AV. I could hear the bass start to distort on all of that on here, so I kind of quit doing that as soon as I could, right, on that with that one. So, but the current drive output on this here, stunningly good, powerful bass, lots of slam, really holographic soundstage and spatial presentation, excellent timbre, just one of the better pairings I have heard for this headphone, period. Transportable or desktop. It is nearly as good, not quite as good, I think. It is nearly as good as what I got out of this from the HiFiMan Golden Wave Prelude amplifier, which has been one of the better amps I have heard for the HiFiMan, or for the Susvara here at any time period. So that this as a $3,000 transportable amp can come anywhere close to the Prelude like it does, to me is really impressive. And so these two go really well together from the current output on this. All right, so there's a little like brief walkthrough of how the Enleum HPA-23RM does with a variety of different headphones and headphone types, and hopefully illustrates like the different flavors of sound that you can get from the two different outputs here, be it current or voltage and all that. So a lot of flexibility in sound and pairings with this thing. So it really allows you to take almost any headphone you want with you. That's not electrostatic anyway. Almost any headphone that you want with you, and it's going to sound pretty decent unless it's just a rare case, probably a rare case where it's just an outright bad synergy. But for what it does with the Susvara, it stands to reason that it would pair well with other hard driving planars like the DCA Stealth or the DCA Expanse or the Abyss AB1266 Phi TC. Okay, things like that, which, I mean, this allows you to take those kind of headphones transportable if you have a way to transport them safely that isn't too bulky, that is. But if you're at home and you want to get away from your desk, you know, if it's not a windy day, so you're going to pop a planar driver or something like that, and you want to go sit out on your deck and all of that, grab this and like the Cord Hugo 2 and put it into the Susvara or the Hexi or like, you know, the Stealth or whatever, or you can take the Stealth outside because it's closed. And it's good. It is likely going to be a really cool, really great sounding transportable setup. So there's a lot to be said for what this can do at $3,000 in a transportable form factor. All right, back to me on camera, probably wrapping this up. I often do comparisons with like product types on this channel when I can. That's going to be difficult with this one because I have heard precious few portable amplifiers anywhere near this price. And when I say precious few, this is the only one, right? So I really can't compare this directly to other like product types. I mean, I can compare it to the amplifier in the Hugo 2 here, which that's still not fair because this is like a $2,500, $2,800 piece that is a DAC and an amp in it, where this is just a $3,000 amp only. So that's really not a fair comparison. But just for quick note, because probably more people have heard the amp output of this than they have of this, this is much more neutral and like clean and clear sounding, a little bit more detail forward. It is not as nearly as full or as rich as this is, particularly from the current output, but I really liked this as a DAC into the amp here. Like these two together are a really amazing combination, whether you use the voltage or the current output here. They just sound great together. And I mean, these two together could really create like basically, I mean, I don't like this term, but as close as you can get to an end game transportable source gear setup on this anyway. Just really excellent. Okay. And then I kind of alluded to this with the Susvara discussion here a little bit ago. Like the comparison that I made was to the HiFiMan Golden Wave Prelude on this. So let me compare this quickly to a couple of desktop amps. That Prelude, for one, the Prelude is the overall better amp, I think, and that's just because it has the advantage of being in a desktop situation where it's got more power and a little bit more control and all of that. And so like what the Prelude does is it's a little bit warmer than the voltage output of this, but not quite as warm as the current drive output. And it's just a little bit more detail forward than the current drive output of this is. So it kind of combines like the strengths of the two presentations here into one amp a little bit. It doesn't go quite as extreme in either way on that, but this is anywhere close to the Prelude, and it is close. Like I say, the Prelude is a little bit better, but it is not by much. It is not by much. Okay, this gets so close to that one in overall quality and overall performance for a $3,000 battery-powered transportable device of this size. Amazing, an amazing accomplishment by Enleum there, in my opinion. Comparing it to the HPA V281 from Vioelectric, the current output here is going to have a similar-ish sound to what the V281 does in terms of the warmth and the thickness and the powerful nature of the sound. It is similar to that, though I think at times the current drive on this takes all of those qualities just a notch or two higher. Not necessarily in terms of overall quality. Like I think even with that warmer, thicker sound, the VAIO is going to be a little bit more holographic than the current output on this and just a little bit more detail forward. But again, not by much, but in terms of the sonic character, picture the HPA V281's sound signature just taken up a little notch in the dynamics and the punch and the powerfulness kind of ways in there. Okay, other amps, the voltage drive output on this sounds vaguely like the Headamp GSX Mini, honestly. Kind of a similar presentation to that, though maybe not quite as much emphasis on the brightness as the Mini has, just to kind of give you a flavor for what kind of sound you're getting out of this from a comparison standpoint. But let's wrap this up. You probably can tell just by the way I'm talking and all of that, that this is a really good product. I'm really excited about this. I wish that I could keep it. I hope to be able to acquire one someday as funds and schedule allow and all of that, and use it as a transportable reference piece, because I already have the Hugo 2 here. And again, these two together sound amazing. You get a great transportable DAC here. You get a great transportable amp here. Put them together and this thing can like drive just about any non-electrostatic headphone out there and do it basically anywhere you want to do it, which is a huge advantage out there. Like that's not something that I was really readily aware of on the market right now, certainly not at $3,000 and at this size. So bravo Enleum, well done. Very easy product to recommend, especially for transportable use. Desktop use, the short battery life may get in the way here and there. You just may find it annoying to have to keep charging it up all of the time. But if you're willing to live with that, then there's no reason that it's not an excellent desktop amplifier too. All right, so I will go ahead and leave it there. I am Wave Theory. This has been my review of the wonderful Enleum HPA-23RM transportable headphone amplifier. If you can afford it and all of that, just go get one. Okay, really good. Thanks for watching. Please like, please comment, check out my PayPal and my Patreon, and do all of those things you do to support YouTube channels, like subscribing if I didn't say that already. And thanks again for watching, and as always, enjoy the music.